Victoria 3 and Vickynomics is what we're going to talk about now. What is Vickynomics? That is a document released by Paradox that sums up everything that was roughly said about Victoria 3 and its economic system on the PDXCon already. So let's have a look at it together. Let's see what the economy of Victoria 3 will be, and let's analyze what this means for Victoria 3. We know that different games have different drivers. For example, in Crusader Kings, usually characters are the drivers of the gameplay. In Hearts of Iron, war is the driver of the gameplay, and in Victoria, economy might be the driver of the gameplay, which is why they released that thing here. For us to look at and to give feedback to also. Even though I think it's a very good document, and with simplicity, it sums up a lot of concepts. With examples, it clarifies them. First, there's a quote from Queen Victoria. "Give my people plenty of beer, good beer and cheap beer, and you will have no revolution among them." Of course, that is the concept of needs in economics. So if you fulfill the basic needs and even overfulfill, oversupply, then people will feel well and there will be no revolution. So, it begins looking at the scale of Victoria 3. We'll have 1 billion people at the game start. Game start is 1836, and this is roughly the number of people that existed at that time on Earth, roughly. We don't know exactly, of course. Whereof 800 million are in subsistence economy, so they're just doing enough that they can survive. To have anything beyond that was a very rare occurrence in these times. What Victoria will have are 750 or a little bit more states belonging to 140 or more markets. We'll come to markets later, and also what states mean. That is roughly like the law, the borders, you know it. But markets are something special for Victoria 3. It's similar to trade places in EU4, but it has a little bit a different touch. So we'll look at that later. We'll come to that. 500 million pounds GDP at game start, most of it in the private sector, because the GDP from things like monarchs was of course not accounted for. There were still remnants of feudal systems that had like no real fiscal connection to a state somewhere. And this of course didn't count to a GDP. So it's a very challenging task to put all of this in an economy model. Looking forward to that very much. There are 50 building types and 50 goods types. Of course, that's very simplified, but they'll probably take the very important goods of the time and take them, like, of course, something like coal would be there, something like metal, things like that, and also something like grains, of course, for bread maybe, things like that. Updated all the time. They're updated all the time, so it's a real-time economy. That's important. It is based on needs of the population, of POPs. There's production and consumption. Buildings such as the textile mills and wet farms produce and also often use various goods. So you need to give them goods so they can produce. So you have to have some goods at the bottom that are needed for a next step, for a next step, for a next step. So the most advanced goods that can be produced are relying on a supply chain. In that, it is a very modern game. But of course, supply chains have existed for very long, but especially in that age where Victoria 3 is situated, these supply chains were becoming more and more global. Also, of course, because of the influence of the British Empire and all of these trade companies, this was a thing. Like before the age of discovery, everything was kind of an isolated market, but then everything was connected even more, and also connected in a way that you would have to rely on supply from a foreign country, something that you would be rather doubtful, would have been rather doubtful to do in a time before that, because it was so unsafe to get that supply that you had to have some kind of backup there. And these backups were in this time more and more shut down. Of course, there was mercantilism, where people would isolate their economies and going for self-produced goods. But more and more people and also states were depending on other states for their supply chains, for the economy. States are limited in what types of resource industries they support. Well, that is interesting. So not every state has the same resources. So, for example, take Germany. Germany, a couple of centuries ago, had a flourishing silver industry, for example. But that silver industry is long dead. There's no more silver in significant amounts there. So they would lose that silver as a resource, and it would maybe be replaced by something else. For example, agriculture is big in Germany right now. You would have something like agriculture or pig export or something like that. That is big at the moment. Then there are POPs. So states are limited in what types of resource industries they support. POPs consume the goods. The goods are made of resources that are made into goods, and these goods are consumed by POPs to maintain their wealth and well-being, of course. Government buildings like barracks also consume goods like ammunition, like these specialized goods. So that is similar to workplaces. Like the government building provides something for the state, and as you're playing as a state actor, you can do something with the people that come out of the government buildings. They need ammunition to function. Whereas you have textile mills and wet farms that are often privately owned. So you would have no influence in them, except if you're going for communism. Then we have infrastructure. How does that connect with everything? Of course, that's the art of connection. Infrastructure from rivers, ports, and railways bring the world closer together, and especially railways. It was the big time of the railways, 1836. Railways were built everywhere, starting most probably in England, connecting like coal mines and steelworks and all kinds of things like that. But from there, it went on to just about everywhere as a colonization tool, as a valuable thing for the industry, everything like that. And whoever had the first functioning railways had a big economic advantage, just in speed and in the manner of bringing as much goods anywhere as needed and as possible. So they bring the world closer together, improving access to goods and also the movement of people. Before, if you would be in some kind of village and you would have a workplace in another village, that was totally unfeasible. But with a railway connection, that could be done. Another village was not another world anymore. It was just a couple of minutes or hours away. You wouldn't have to rely on horses and carriages to bring you somewhere. That were also mostly reserved for the ones that had like a lot of money. So the movement by foot was something that was also changed to something that was seen as, if you would go by foot in these times, it was something revolutionary, because there was clearly a better alternative now, and that was the railways. So we would only go for really low mileage by foot. And anything beyond, you would take some of these new connectors that were mostly driven by steam. Only the very poor people walk by foot, or wandering around. Hiking was invented then. The first hikers were seen as totally crazy people. They were seen as mad, a rebellion against society even. So this is how it changed the world. From going by foot to going by train was a very big step in the perception, in that the path of something, the path something had to take, disappeared from your view. It wasn't seen anymore. You now had only destinations. People were no longer real travelers. They were tourists. If they went somewhere, they knew the first place and the place they arrived, but not the path in between. The path in between was lost. So there were some landscapes that were just lost. They were out of the public consciousness because they were only the land where some railways were laid, and that was like passed on. And that of course led to the concentration of many people in cities and a bigger concentration on markets. Markets that were created in the big cities mostly, and in the big harbors as main connectors, are regions in which goods are freely traded, one or several countries under a single market owner. So you have a market owner, but in that market, a couple of countries can participate. If you have a big harbor, like Hamburg or London, something like that, then always a couple of countries have access to that harbor. And maybe even the whole world as it is now. Certainly the colonies belonging to the country, but also the allies of that country, certainly not countries that would be at war with the country. Global war, that was also something new. Usually you only had war with your neighbors, but especially in this age, you could have war with countries that were tons of miles away. Now we come from infrastructure, the great connector, the driver of everything, to pricing. And you cannot forget that especially time was invented there. Time as a driver of the workday was invented there because the railways needed times to say, hey, we'll be there at that time and we'll go away again at another time to make the supply chains work. And for that reason, universal time was introduced. Before that, you had clocks in just about a lot of villages, mostly at the church. But these would be different to other villages, even a few miles away. And certainly, if they were like 100 miles away, there would be a big difference. So you had a spread of time in one country of like even over an hour or even more, depending on where you would be. So you would be at the start of the railway age, you would be at one train station, go to the other train station, and you would have to deal with a different local time. Of course, that is an absolute mess if you have to rely on when your railway should be where. So that was changed. These universal timekeeping systems were introduced everywhere. And the reason for that was clearly the connection for trade and from the railways, because everyone had to depend on them. Not so much the ships, because ships on time is something not really feasible, but certainly the railways made the time. Pricing were of course resulting from access to goods. All goods have a market price based on supply and demand. States with poor market access due to underdeveloped infrastructure suffer adverse local prices because it's so costly to bring the goods to them. Or it takes so long, or you cannot bring enough goods to them. Price is everything is a mantra here. Underproduced goods are expensive and make you reliant on imports for the goods, while overproduced goods are cheap to buy but unprofitable to make. And of course, you would try to export them to another market then. And there trade comes in. It can be that suddenly something changes in a society and you have different supplies, and then something that is there that is overproduced. So you either change your production or you try to export some things. And here we connect to the pop needs, the changing pop needs. Needs can be fulfilled by a variety of goods. You have the goods here. Current basic food expenses for 7.35k Dixie farmers in Louisiana, which we have here. Apparently a pop of farmers is 7,350 farmers in Louisiana. And they would get 1.99 grain, which costs roughly 37 pounds. Then around one fish, which costs roughly 19. A half meat, which costs 17. A half fruit, which also costs 17. And a third of groceries, which costs 14. A total cost of 104. So the basic food expenses basically make what you call in economic theory like the normal basket of supply that everyone needs, right? It is something that you need to fulfill to get to a basic standard of living. Significant factors affecting the pop's standard of living there are, first, the average of 40% income taxation level. Then that clothes, so beyond the basic expenses, we have clothes. Clothes are expensive there and make up 17% of expenditures. Furniture also makes up 11% of expenditures, and services make up 14% of expenditures. But something has been successful in here. As you can see, standard of living is going upwards. How can you reach that? First, you improve like the access to the basics. If they become cheaper, then they can afford the more expensive goods. Or you improve the access to the expensive goods once the basic needs are dealt with. And then, of course, the standard of living is rising because the pop income is enough to buy more goods. After needs are fulfilled, any leftover money builds wealth and standard of living. So the pop can also gain wealth in that part. Improving the standard of living leads to increased population growth. Of course, if you don't only have to look after yourself, you might also have kids or give your neighbors something or whatever that, and turns pops into loyalists. If people feel well, that is standard economic theory, they turn into loyalists. Today there's another economic theory that says if people have too much, they get all kind of weird. They get spoiled, if you want so. But that is also discussable because, yeah, of course, if people have infinite money, you can see that they act sometimes very weird. Worsening conditions, on the other hand, turn pops into radicals. Of course, they will start to oppose the government. That is absolutely logical. Like, a lot of revolutions, or at least tried rebellions, have been caused, at least in the Middle Ages, by food shortages. And that turns pops into radicals because they have to change something. They have to change. They know they will have to die in like 10 months. If anything, if there's no change, they will die in 10 months. And say, hey, if I die this month, I don't care. At least I can change something, or I have the chance to change something. So if you give them enough wages, that will not happen, of course. If they have enough wages to fulfill their needs. For example, we have a logging camp here in Tennessee, so you can already see that. The US will be a big thing there. We had a lot of US examples here. We see the information screen. And there's a yearly productivity per employee. That is 4.5 pounds per year. And we have an average annual wage of 4.26 per year. So there is a small profit to be had there. It has some cash reserves, it has full employment, there is some weekly taxes that you get from that thing. But overall that will not be a big profit, like it's something you would also have a workforce slider here and some modifiers that you can look at. You have a look at the average annual wage and it expands into something. Logging camps, average annual wage is 4.26. So it starts with 3.45 for the laborers. So with a price of average annual wage of 4.26, you see that laborers are the vast majority of the workforce. Then you have machinists with 5.18, probably also a number. Then a little bit less, probably engineers with 10.3, and 20.7 the managers, the capitalists, the CEOs. Whoever they get are roughly, I don't know, 5 times the stuff of the laborers. But that was something usual. Like that were definitively realistic values back then. And of course, the owner of the whole business, that's totally another thing. He would get the profits, right? Or this could be something run by the state, but that is only probably in communism. I'm just speculating here. Privately owned buildings have full control over their wages and try to maximize their profits. That is then probably done by the AI as you are playing the state. Countries control government and military wages, which benefit different parts of their society. Of course, you can see that you have a standard wage there, and that wage will lead to other wages also being improved as they're in competition for workforces. If you don't have enough workforce, the wages will rise in that society. On the other hand, you have government subsidies that will guarantee a good wage to keep the production of a specialized good high. So if you want to specialize in a good, if you want to have a lot from that good, you want to give subsidies to it, because it's quite very important. You want to have full employment there and not only rely on the private market. Then you can get taxes from the economy. You can have income taxes, poll taxes, consumption taxes, and dividends taxes. So the income taxes deducted from the wages paid, they're just for everyone. There you go. Poll taxes would be per head. That was something that was mainly done in the medieval ages and in the old feudal systems. Because you existed, you had to pay something. And that was often the same for everyone. But there were also things like you had to pay depending on where you stand in the society. So that were poll taxes. This is why, until today, polling is viewed as a really bad thing, even if it's anonymized. People have a bias against polling because there was a time when polling meant you had to pay for your existence. Consumption taxes, of course, you know consumption taxes on goods bought. And we'll see if there is a difference between different goods bought, if you can have an extra consumption tax on luxury goods. It doesn't look like it from there, but there are some icons here. One of them looks like alcohol, and so maybe there's something extra for that. Then you have dividends taxes that are on profits made. So these are basically the taxes for the factory owners, for the business owners, but not personally, but for their businesses. So the taxes are made on the profits that the businesses make. Who is taxed and how much depends on the laws. Now we come to trade. Trade is another of these interconnectors. Infrastructure makes trade possible. You have to use your trading fleet to import and export goods with allies and rivals alike. So trading fleet seems like ships, mostly, of course, from the colonies, but can also be, I think, interconnected railways. Something like that. Something like that. Export goods, you have a competitive advantage to manufacture. That is a tip. So you should export goods. You have a competitive advantage to manufacture because they can make profits for your society. You can exchange them for other goods that others can make well. For example, if you have iron and coal, you make steel. The competitive advantage is that you don't have to transport it through the whole world. You can make it just there, and boom, there you go. You can export it. Import resources you lack or manufactured goods your people need. So you can either import the resources and then manufacture goods with them, or you can directly import the manufactured goods, which is a little bit more expensive probably, but will also fulfill the needs of your people. Then you have trade routes. The trade routes can be mutually beneficial or aggressive. Aggressive trade routes come to mind if you think of the colonization treaties. And some colonies were specifically designed to have, for example, not enough food, or to have something extremely lacking for their businesses. And so they were dependent on the motherland to deliver them with goods. That was a form of power, that was an economic power. So to keep that there, to stop independence, you would make them dependent. And that is so, trade is not only a driver of economy, but also a strong means of power in that system, especially connected to colonization. Where we come to the economic systems. As one of many types of laws, you can change the country's economic system, drastically changes your playstyle. You see, you have different things you can enact or not enact. Traditionalism is one of them. Isolationism, mercantilism, agrarianism, free trade, and command economy. That sounds a little bit communist, I have to say. So there's a couple of things. At the moment, it seems like that mercantilism is enacted, and the people are not really liking it when you see the thumbs down, thumbs up ratios. They rather want isolationism or traditionalism or agrarianism, but also not free trade and command economy. We'll have to see what these thumbs up, thumbs down mean. Imports, for example, are penalized under mercantilism because it's a pre-form of isolationism. Isolationist countries aim for total self-sufficiency. Mercantilist countries only protect their own economy and want to have their own economy for just about everything. Under free trade, pop investments are plentiful, but subsidies are limited. Because everyone, for free trade to work, for free trade treaties to work, everyone says, hey, you can't give your business X governmental help. That would give them an unfair advantage and we would be dominated. So we don't want that. Then there's the conclusion. Your economy is not only your country's engine, but also shapes the population. You can also say it's different, like your population shapes the economy or your resources shape the economy, but it's all interconnected. Access to cheap resources and captive markets influence the diplomacy, because it's clear that you have to have some kind of diplomatic relationship to the countries that you depend on for resources, and that depend on you for resources. It gives you power over them, and they get power over you, but in return, the one that pays for goods also has some kind of power, because that money is also needed by the others. All actions reverberate through the economy, creating new economic and political challenges. Who is dependent on whom will be very important and will form a global society more than ever before. Even though trade is very old and these worldwide trade webs have existed thousands of years ago already, the increased speed and connectability of trade through the new technologies means that you truly have global relationships now, and not only neighbors or extended neighbors relationships. I've already said that at the supply chains. You have to have supply chains that you can rely on. And with these supply chains, you get more possibilities. But once you have used these possibilities, you want to continue to use what you have created through that. And then you have to find more dependent partners that can give you the resources or the goods that make the new behavior, the new technology possible still. So it's an interconnected web through an economic system, trade, infrastructure, and driven by pops and economy. And also, of course, by the rulers. And sometimes, certainly, of war. I mean, who doesn't want to have oil in that time? Or coal, rather. What do you think of the Vickynomics system? Do you think it's a good way to explain the world? Do you think it's good to gamify that? Or how good of a simulator of history will it be? I think it's definitely very, very difficult to describe economy in a macroeconomic way, but if you go from from the pop as the driver of the whole economy, as the fundamental thing, and have a bottom-up model, like from the pops to the factories, from the pops combined with the resources to some kind of factories, to producing goods, and the connectivity from what is lacking. I think that makes for a very good explanation and also a very good simulator of economy. And it will be very interesting to see how you can play around with that, how you can win that, how you can lose that, and what kind of web you will be able to create or destroy. Thank you for watching and happy gaming to you. This is Immanuel Can signing out. Have a great time until then, and happy gaming.